19, 2003, coalition troops invaded Iraq, aiming for Saddam Hussein and Baghdad with all of the force and might of the United States military. The invasion generated a flood of intelligence from satellite imagery, weapons-mounted video feeds, computers, broadcast news reports, and telephone and radio calls from troops on the ground. All of it was gathered, sorted, and filtered by United States Central Command, or CENTCOM, a modern military command post. CENTCOM isn't the entire U.S. military structure that monitors the world. It is just one part of that structure, the part that monitors the so-called Central Region. Other command posts similar to CENTCOM have different responsibilities, including monitoring other regions of the world or handling specialized military functions. But all modern command posts are at their core conduits of information. CENTCOM is the premier example of the modern command post because it is enmeshed in the most hostile region on the planet. The tools it uses to gather and sort information have to be cutting edge.
There is a belt of conflict and turmoil that runs across the center of the globe, through Africa, through the Middle East and Central Asia. And it is from this belt of turmoil that most of the conflict in today's world is happening. And CENTCOM happens to sit smack dab in the middle of this belt of turmoil.
CENTCOM is a joint command center, headed by General John Abizaid, with its main post at MacDill Air Force Base outside Tampa, Florida, and another forward command post in Doha, Qatar, right within its area of responsibility, or AOR. These two command posts are tethered by communications equipment, and together they monitor events in a 25-country swath. Although CENTCOM was established more than 2 decades ago, CENTCOM's forward command post in Doha, Qatar, was constructed in just 3 months in 2003, after planners felt it was safe and necessary to have a military presence within the CENTCOM AOR.
You might ask yourself, is that a workable solution? How can a command have real-time operational control over a very complex area of the world, 12,000 miles away? Quite possible due to technology and communications.
Bringing such a complex communications network to an area of the world with relatively low-tech infrastructure presented challenges to those planning CENTCOM's forward command post in late 2002.
We loaded the headquarters aboard a ship and deployed it to Qatar. We sent an advanced party here just about 10 days before the headquarters arrived, all crated up in its collapsible boxes, and they prepared the area inside a big hangar-like structure, which was nice because it allowed us better environmental control.
We were connected through fiber optic connections. Then we came in, set up the headquarters, and we were able to link into those connections to give the headquarters the connectivity it needed to do the warfighting.
Within months, CENTCOM was a joint command, part in Tampa and part in Doha. The two posts worked together to monitor the AOR, manage the situation in Afghanistan, and conduct the war in Iraq.
We are focused over here on the immediacy of the war effort in Iraq and Afghanistan. But at the same time, being forward allows us to go out and engage with all of the 25 countries that are in this area of responsibility.
During the war, this place was a hum of professionalism. Each desk that you see behind me was very busy, gathering information, assessing what it meant within the context of the ongoing battle, and framing decisions for the commander.
Having CENTCOM's forward command thousands of miles away in Qatar, and its base back at MacDill, Florida, made for some logistical challenges that only the most sophisticated communications tools could overcome.
Technology today allows us to keep everybody pretty much informed on what's going on and up to speed. And that's the real challenge of the split operations. It's keeping everybody on the same sheet of music.
NavCent Bahrain, this is CENTCOM for a comms check. How do you read?
This is NavCent Bahrain. I have you loud and clear.
Email, satellites, telephones, computer screens, video conferences, A network of the most sophisticated communications technology available enables command posts to develop intelligence into an overwhelming military advantage.
Communications aided by high technology these days is what we call a force multiplier. It actually enhances the ability of your force to have any effect in warfare.
The purpose of this secure video teleconference is to facilitate command of the central command component commanders responsible.
Modern command posts provide three basic types of information.
First is situational awareness. It will provide a general understanding of what is happening in our area of responsibility, or more specifically, an understanding of the insurgency that is ongoing in Iraq or ongoing al-Qaeda terrorist activities in Afghanistan. The second type of information it will provide is force protection information. Essentially, we receive information about threats or impending attacks upon our forces in the area of responsibility. Finally, we provide targeting information, and targeting is key to any application of military force.
Every moment of every day, intelligence information is analyzed at CENTCOM in Doha and in Florida.
Anything that emits a signal, be it friendly or enemy, gets placed on that screen. In the middle screen is a video teleconference. We do those every day, and we collaborate with DIA, CIA, and also our subordinate commands. To your top right is a tool called Top Scene. We manipulate the imagery so that it appears in a three-dimensional environment. There's a chat session going on with folks in our forward headquarters in Qatar. You also see between them there's a phone called the internet phone, IP phone, and it allows secure communication at the top secret level. Again, a good collaborative tool.
Today's command posts are actually communications hubs, technologically unparalleled and able to gather information from anywhere, send it to anywhere, and do it securely and in real time.
The technology really allows you to get inside the enemy's decision cycle, and that's critical. I mean, that simply means that we know more than he knows about the battlefield and the battle space that's over it, and we know it sooner and quicker, and therefore we're able to make decisions on that quicker.
So this process needs to happen very quickly if you want it to be effective in warfare. And one of the major differences between the 1991 Gulf War and the 2003 Gulf War is we've cut this process from days to hours to minutes.
What you're looking at here is a 3-day look at activity inside of Iraq. It's human reporting as well as other sources, other intelligence disciplines. And what we try and do is take a look at a specific site. We drill down into those sites using other sources to try and identify specific locations in order to target and track those individuals. We hand them off to special operations forces and conventional forces inside of Iraq so they either capture or kill those individuals.
Central Command is just one of 9 United States unified command posts that envelop the entire planet. There are 4 other regional commands. European Command monitors Europe, most of Africa, and much of Asia. Pacific Command monitors Southern Asia, Australia, and Antarctica. Southern Command monitors portions of Central and South America. Northern Command, the newest, formed in the wake of the September 11th attacks, oversees North America and is responsible for homeland security. 4 other non-regional commands complete the unified command structure, including Transportation Command, which handles logistics, the delivery of all military equipment, food, and even soldiers. Joint Forces Command is in charge of coordinating the various military branches, troops, and military experimentation. Strategic Command controls military space operations, strategic warning and intelligence assessments, and global strategic planning. Special Operations Command controls secret military operations requiring specialized training. Each unified command has a command structure similar to CENTCOM.
The commander CENTCOM answers directly to the Secretary of Defense, and he or she to the President. So there's a direct chain of command with only one person in between, the President of the United States and the Central Command commander.
And what is true of CENTCOM's communications network is true of each of the command posts among the unified commands.
Where coming from?
But because CENTCOM's AOR is the hotspot, it frequently implements the latest technology first, enabling commanders like Abizaid to literally conduct a war from thousands of miles away if they need to.
the commander now has the ability to choose his location rather than being dictated by geography. We can provide the commander with all the information that he needs no matter where he's located on the planet.
Modern technology has made command posts like CENTCOM possible, although the long history of warfare is marked by much slower communication. But when information was available, it often gave a decisive advantage. The regions contested by the Palestinians and Israelis are actually under the jurisdiction of European Command, not Central Command. Command Central will return on Modern Marvels. Military intelligence has always been a vital component of every commander's arsenal.
City HQ, this is Tampa.
Today, it continues to provide a tactical advantage to command posts like CENTCOM, just as it has since the very first command post ever gathered information about an enemy.
From the very beginning that we have descriptions of battles, that's what we always look for, the intelligence. Who had it? Who needed it? Did it get there in time?
Ancient commanders were also kings, which meant political and military powers were centralized within the leader.
Thutmose III, for example, a famous conquering general, had dozens of campaigns in the north and southern border and would lead them himself. Now, he didn't have to report back to himself because he's already in the field.
But often, word had to be sent from one commander to another, or to his troops, usually over a battlefield. Sometimes flags and musical instruments were used to convey tactical information over the din of battle. These signals, originating in the recesses of history, were adapted and employed well into the 20th century.
Some of the earliest forms of communications included horns, bugles, conch shells, and drums. The bugle, for instance, was used to give tactical signals on the battlefield. A certain series of notes would mean certain things to the troops, and the noise of the bugle could carry above the din of battle. Troops could hear it and react accordingly. To the actual soldier in combat, the flag was a focal point for him in a chaos of war. A soldier, bullets flying around him, smoke blinding him, whatever. If he could see the flag, if he could see the direction the flag was moving, he could focus on that flag and follow it.
Over greater distances, visual cues were more difficult. Sometimes simple messages could be relayed using fire.
That type of signal can be of the one if by land, two if by sea. It will just tell you that there's been an invasion. It has to be a prearranged signal.
The Romans improved on this simple communication tool, using an A-frame made of large timbers that could be either raised or lowered. On each timber was a fire that signaled a code.
You break the alphabet up into blocks of so many letters per block. The first torch tells you which block. The second signal tells you which letter within the block. And so you can actually spell things out alphabetically.
But most intelligence from ancient battlefields and commanders required transporting a physical thing, using a messenger to verbally relay the message or hand over the tablet. Technology was basic: a swift runner or a good horse, and a good road.
Sending a messenger or a horse rider through wilderness, can't really count on that, especially during inclement weather. Now, a road gives you a path. That way the messenger knows the way back, and also during weather it increases the chance of getting there.
Once all roads led to Rome, military strategists could combine this broadcast network with the courier service, by foot or horse, to relay information from the far reaches of the empire back to the Senate. But lag time, sometimes as great as months from an outpost like Britain, prevented distant capitals like Rome from functioning as battle-time command posts in outlying areas.
Centralization was possible to the extent that Rome was the capital, and the Senate obviously ran the war because it sent the consuls out in order to execute that war. Very often foreign policy was made on the borders.
At a time when military commanders were among the few who were literate, written communication was a form of security, though it wasn't foolproof. Messages by courier could also be intercepted, with monumental consequences.
When Hannibal was in the south of Italy, waiting for his brother to reinforce him, his brother sends a letter to Hannibal saying, let's meet up and we'll crush the Romans. Hannibal writes back, then the Romans intercept it. So now they know where his reinforcements are. They proceed to the north of Italy, defeat Hasdrubal, cut his head off, and then ride all the way down to the south of Italy and bowl the head into the tent of Hannibal. Sort of a message, your reinforcements aren't coming.
Securing intelligence sometimes required a disguise, a message scratched on tablets of lead and tied to a swimmer's arm for waterproof delivery. Or etched on thin sheets of lead, then curled into a tube to be worn as a woman's earring. Or tattooed on the shaved head of a slave and delivered only after his hair had grown back.
The only message he was to deliver was shave my head. It would work with a military censor now.
Military centralization didn't improve in the centuries following the Roman Empire. In fact, it declined during the Middle Ages as road systems fell apart and feudal hierarchy decentralized power, both political and military.
You still had essentially communications that was, for the most part on the battlefield, no faster than your fastest rider. And that was the way of things for some 2 millennia.
But a decisive change was evident during the American Civil War, due to 2 revolutionary technologies. The first was the telegraph, which for the first time since fire signals made distant communication possible without transporting a physical message.
This is an example of a Civil War telegraph key. This particular example is called a camelback because of the hump of the lever arm for the key. What you would have here are a couple of contacts that once the contacts are closed, a spark is created which travels along the line to a sounder. This would be at a distant station, and the spark goes through these coils here and through induction makes this lever arm click against the other.
Battlefield reports now traveled at electric speed. The dashes and dots of Morse code still needed to be translated, but distant commanders could coordinate quickly without leaving their command posts.
The military telegraph was used to connect general headquarters to corps headquarters, down to division headquarters, but it usually didn't extend much farther than that, down to the company level, down to the foot soldier, the front lines, if you will.
Below division commanders, communication was verbal. General Grant, who had a telegraph key at his command post, could send messages to President Lincoln in Washington, faster than he could send messages to his own lieutenants. But the telegraph presented its own challenges.
There are attempts to link division commanders with corps commanders, with army commanders at Gettysburg by running telegraph wire. And the experiment was partially successful. The skilled telegrapher could send messages quite quickly, so you could get an answer back in 15 or 20 minutes to a query.
A command post like Grant's, usually established in a nearby commandeered home or even a church, might have anywhere from 5 to 15 men, mostly clerks hand-copying orders. Others would gather information from couriers and dispatch it to officers. Still others would man the telegraph. Tables were used to display maps of nearby battlefields. These maps might even include topographic information gathered by map-making scouts. The second revolutionary technology that changed the Civil War command post was the railroad.
The railroad kind of drove the telegraph. In other words, with the railroad being able to move a large number of troops quickly, you had to have a means to get that word to the commander.
A steam locomotive could sustain speeds far exceeding the top speed of a horse, as long as the track was maintained, and the military could transport more on them than just couriers.
It was able to utilize the railroad in moving large numbers of troops rapidly to the field. Jefferson Davis himself, for example, at the First Battle of Manassas, telegraphing the commander on the field to bring reinforcements, and they arrive by railroad.
Command posts were able to collect remote information, evaluate it, then swiftly act with decisive force. The North controlled more telegraph lines and railroad track than the South. So communication was a tactical advantage, as long as the post could manage all the intelligence. And that required a staff of command post office workers. In addition to bureaucracy, centralization created another burden, at least from a military perspective: civilian oversight.
these telegraph lines become very important to connecting Army field commanders to the Central Command in Washington at the War Department. That's where the telegraph lines all fed into. Curiously enough, they never continued the telegraph lines over to the White House just across the street. And Abraham Lincoln would make his daily journeys from the White House and sit patiently listening to the ticker machines bring in the reports.
As important as the telegraph and the railroad were to the evolution of command posts, they would both be eclipsed by innovations in communication technology that took place in the years following the end of the Civil War. Sending messages via carrier pigeons by exploiting their natural homing instincts has a long military history, but an inconsistent one for the United States. During World War I, U.S. carrier pigeons made excellent targets for enemy guns in Europe. Command Central will return on Modern Marvels. Command posts continued their path toward further centralization in part due to an 1876 invention. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone improved on the telegraph by sending a human voice along the cables rather than a coded blip. The phone made real-time two-way conversation possible over great distances. The military was eager to exploit its potential.
By the 1880s, the United States Army is pushing for a field telephone, and the person doing it is Adolphus Greeley. He develops the field telephone, and the United States Army uses it.
Here you have a camp telephone of World War I vintage. Telephony had developed by the start of the World War, and this was a new method of communication used within the front lines. You would have two telephone units connected by a wire, of course, and if you wanted to make a call, you'd lift up on the handset here, reach over here and turn a crank, which would send a signal down the wire and ring a bell on the other end, alerting the other end that there was a call coming in. And once you got the call on the other line, you would just talk normally.
A large battery inside the unit provided the power. The field telephone brought communication from Command Central to just behind the front. But because it needed a wire connection to a network, it was vulnerable to artillery. The logical improvement over the telegraph and telephone was real-time two-way communication without a landline. Marconi patented a wireless telegraph in 1895, precursor to the radio. But early wireless devices were big and heavy.
Marconi's was practicable aboard ships where weight didn't make much difference, and was adopted by the Navy by 1910 or 11.
Ironically, World War I military command centers were able to communicate with naval ships far out at sea with relative ease using the radio. Yet communication with frontline troops in the foxholes of eastern France was still impossible due to the size of the unwieldy devices.
It's one reason why World War I offensives bogged down is because the infantry generally tries to advance in concert with the artillery, with the rolling barrages. But inevitably there were snags. Barbed wire would slow infantrymen down. And so the artillery barrage, a time barrage, would roll forward, but the infantry would generally fall behind.
More precisely, there was no quick way for the men in the trenches to communicate with the artillery via the command post to challenges they faced at the front. Messengers proved too slow. But elsewhere in the theater of war, improvements in transportation were aiding military communication. The internal combustion engine paved the way for the automobile, faster than a courier's horse and more agile than a railroad locomotive. But it was the airplane's use of the internal combustion engine that really provided a leap forward in communication.
The United States Army Signal Corps issues the first contract for an airplane, for a military airplane, with the Wright brothers in 1908. So this is hardly 5 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. But make no mistake, in the First World War, the key importance of the aircraft was reconnaissance. It wasn't bombing, it wasn't the fighter, it was reconnaissance.
Reconnaissance planes provided a tactical advantage due to another technology invented in the 19th century. The photographic camera. Because observers couldn't remember or sketch the labyrinthine trench system, photographs were the most important intelligence a World War I plane could capture. Photos and other data could be couriered by auto or flown back to General Pershing's headquarters in western France. Pershing and his staff created a command central out of commandeered French buildings behind the front. Couriers gave information from the front to clerks who copied, encoded, and sent the information on through telegraph, telephone, or radio connections, up the chain of command to Washington if necessary. Sometimes information from above came down to Pershing's post, where his staff determined who needed to know what before sending it on its way. Reconnaissance photos, battlefield maps, intercepted enemy communications, requests for supplies, all passed through Pershing's command post and were evaluated. The command post had become a clearinghouse, sorting and prioritizing a deluge of intelligence. With overseas telegraph and telephone cables and radio relay stations connecting Pershing to Washington, the United States was on the verge of running the war thousands of miles from the battlefield.
The Army Signal Corps in World War I connected Washington, D.C. with Pershing's headquarters in France, with the divisional commanders. In other words, Washington could talk to the divisional commanders if Washington so chose to do that.
But Washington chose not to.
One reason why Washington wasn't running the war is that Woodrow Wilson did not particularly feel that he was capable of running the war. So essentially Washington gave Pershing carte blanche. But certainly this communications net enabled Pershing to immediately transmit requests for necessities.
Military professionals hoped political leaders would trust the system. Even after the armistice in 1918, military planners continued improving communications technology, like the telephone and the radio, strengthening the capabilities of command posts for the anticipated next war. And by World War II, new technology was finally able to connect Washington, D.C. to the commanders at the front lines.
This is a Signal Corps BC611 transceiver. What you would do with this is, after you've jumped with it, a lot of times paratroopers jumped with it and they have this cover to keep you from inadvertently sending out a signal. You take the cover off. You would take off the antenna cover, extend the antenna, and the act of extending the antenna actually turns the unit on, and then press the PTT switch, the push to talk switch, and talk into this normally. Release the switch to receive. You have a sling, so you can put it over your shoulder, so you can be looking at a map or whatever while you're using it, or sling it over your back when not in use. Turn the unit off, push the antenna back down into its housing. This is a BC1000 walkie-talkie. This is an FM radio as opposed to the AM transceiver that we just looked at. This has greater range than the handheld transceiver, and it also is less resistant to interference thanks to the frequency modulation. To operate this, you would tune in your frequency here. Again, this is an advantage over the handheld, which is a fixed frequency. This is a tunable frequency. You have a handset right here. When you talk, you rotate this little lever with your thumb to talk, and then release to receive.
The knob switched the circuit from the receiver attached to the earphone to the transmitter in the mouthpiece. Secretary of War George Marshall embraced technology, which allowed him to conduct from Washington a single war in two regions thousands of miles apart: the European theater and the Pacific theater. This idea of separate theaters of war managed simultaneously from far away was possible only because of improved communication. Yet Marshall gave his regional commanders enormous autonomy.
If you look at Marshall's administrative philosophy, it's something like that of a very large, well-run corporation with branch offices. And the boss at the center, if he is good, has excellent information flow from the heads of those branch offices.
Eisenhower called the War Department in Washington from his European theater command post in France, days after the June 6, 1944 D-Day invasion, to order vital tank parts. Marshall was also in close communication with General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz, both managing the Pacific Theater. But on the other side of the front, there was a perfect illustration of the flaw inherent in a centralized command structure. A micromanaging dictator at the very center of a centralized command.
Hitler is the perfect example of a national leader who concerned himself not only with the movement of armies, but with the movement of divisions, with the movement of units of brigade size, battalion size, that is, units of fewer than 1,000 men. And Hitler's interference, which this modern communications made possible, was a great advantage to us.
Communications technology enabled the World War II command post to monitor battlefields across the globe. But the next war would for the most part be a cold one, based on high-tech spying, greater centralization, and more bureaucracy in the command structure. As a captain during World War I, future General George Marshall so impressed General Pershing that after the armistice, Pershing made him his aide-de-camp. Command Central will return on Modern Marvels. After World War II, the United States was the dominant Western power against the Communists in the subsequent Cold War. Former Secretary of War George Marshall worked with President Truman to create a new centralized military based on regional commands connected by superior communication technology. His changes began at the top.
He began to back what we would call the Defense Department. That is a single unified cabinet-level department in which all the military branches would be under a single civilian chief.
Under Truman, Marshall created the Joint Chiefs of Staff, representing the different branches of the military, which would answer to the newly created Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense answered only to the President. Eventually, as the unified command posts we know today evolved, they too would answer directly to the Secretary of Defense.
So while Marshall does not invent the modern Army's organizational structure, he certainly is the man who was at least as important as anyone else in showing the way that it should be done.
Technologies that would support and enhance this new command structure were embodied in the computer and the satellite.
Our need to have rapid communications was, of course, pushed very hard by the threat of a Soviet surprise attack on the United States, a nuclear Pearl Harbor, a decapitation strike against the leadership in Washington, D.C. by big Soviet ICBMs might well take out the entire National Command Authority.
Satellites offered instant early detection, important in a Soviet ICBM attack that might take only 30 minutes.
We need the ability to look into the Soviet Union and discern what their intentions are. It was important to get satellites up, and we achieved that by the early 1960s.
Monitoring events throughout the world was easier with a giant eye floating overhead that could beam information back to Washington and its military command posts. Now those military posts needed a giant brain. Early computers were already tabulating artillery accuracy during the later stages of World War II. By the 1950s, they were working to collect and store intelligence.
You need the help of computers to help process all this data. It's more data than a human can get through in a timely manner. In the late 1950s, the military created ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and its job was to develop new communications technologies. Well, ARPA scientists fiddled around with computers, linked them together, and by 1969, they had 4 nodes connected together in what they called an ARPANET. Now, from this ARPANET grew more nodes until it evolved into the internet that we know it today.
These innovations made communication ever faster and more complete. Photographs could be sent via satellite, as could television images. Messages could be broadcast from one computer to another. The need to physically courier a message was long gone, but weaknesses in the system weren't. During the war in Vietnam in the 1960s, opponents with fewer resources and less technology exploited them by fighting low-tech guerrilla-style wars.
They have adopted a very fine cell-like system that suppresses the flow of information. And this makes it difficult for a technologically oriented society like ours to break into that.
America continued to pursue a more centralized regional command structure, even as the Cold War began to thaw in the 1980s and 1990s. But events in the Near East and North Africa, plus the strategic importance of oil, refocused attention toward that region of the world.
Before the creation of Central Command, the world was divided up between the European Command, which stretched as far as Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the Pacific Command, which actually included Pakistan and India, and the dividing line between the commands was at that border.
A long war between Iran and Iraq followed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Iranian hostage crisis, both in 1979. President Carter created the Rapid Deployment Task Force, which monitored these Middle Eastern events and was on standby to intervene militarily.
Then when Reagan became president, he decided that the best thing to do with this rather ad hoc unit called the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force was to turn it into a full-fledged unified command in the same sense as the European Command, the Pacific Command.
Central Command became a full command in 1983. CENTCOM's stewardship of the region was put to the test when in 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait. Again, the world's eyes were riveted to this volatile region under Central Command's watch.
But what really set things into motion was the U.S. decision to send over 500,000 troops, plus the troops of some 30-odd other coalition members to invade Iraq and Kuwait and take back Kuwait from the Iraqis in 1991. This put the command on a totally different footing, and from that level of strategic attention flowed the new technologies, the innovative military experiences, and other advantages, if you will, over the 1990s.
The Gulf War was also the last war in a long line of American military engagements before communications technology truly permeated every aspect of warfare.
The Gulf War of 1991 was, in many ways, the Cold War battle that we never fought against the Soviets. And we got glimpses of the future of an information technology-driven war, but it was not one. It was a war that was still fought mostly by tank ships and planes. And so the modern wars that started with the Civil War and ended with the Gulf War, really wars that were characterized by industrial mass. And World War II really being the apogee of that style of warfare. But if you look at wars of the information age, in World War II, what it took 1,000 bombers to destroy could be destroyed by 100 bombers in Vietnam. Could be destroyed by maybe 10 bombers in the 1991 Gulf War, and can now be destroyed by 1 bomber or even less in the 2003 Iraq War because of the advances in information technology and communications, not so much the advances in weaponry.
The war in Iraq that began on March 19, 2003, was a new war for a new era, managed by computer and telephone and video conferences from command posts, hundreds, even thousands of miles away. Communication technology no longer simply helped relay messages and gather intelligence. Now it made bombs smarter, tanks deadlier, and the fighting force smaller. Of the 9 unified commands, Strategic Command is responsible for space surveillance or monitoring man-made objects orbiting Earth. Command Central will return on Modern Marvels. The future of the command post is virtual, a command post that exists in the web of electronic communications rather than a real place of brick and mortar. In future wars, computers will allow soldiers and battlefield commanders to pull down from this virtual command post their own options based on their environment, rather than having a plan thrust upon them.
We will design systems where the user will be able to determine, much like the users of the internet do, what they want to see. So the broadcaster won't be in charge of what information goes to the user will be in charge.
In future wars, information will become the primary weapon. In future wars, soldiers may even remain back at the command post, safely removed from the battlefield.
Why send a soldier or a pilot somewhere where you can send an unmanned vehicle that can provide the same sort of information, in fact, better information, because an unmanned vehicle not only can have several different kinds of sensory devices built into it, but it only exposes the technology to danger when it gets in trouble and not a human life.
Technology can now bring a realistic virtual version of the battlefield right to the command post. Examples of this futuristic, net-centric warfare were on display during the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Look at the second Gulf War, where daily you're faxing large number of things back and everybody is on instant messaging and everybody's emailing back with regularity. That changed the whole approach to technology in less than a decade. I think sometimes we forget that in the first Gulf War, we didn't even have email.
In both Afghanistan and in Iraq recently, you had the specter of B-2 bombers running their daily bombing missions from Missouri to Afghanistan and Iraq and back again, controlled by headquarters from Florida and supplied by information gathered maybe another continent away and sent to them in real time.
And that network will only get more powerful. Global positioning systems may someday be sewn into every uniform. Video cameras may someday be installed into every helmet. Computer programs can generate nearly infinite scenarios for how a conflict might play out. The technology exists, but the flow of information may become overwhelming.
Even though we have the ability to get things from satellites and to electronically monitor information, it complicates things because we wind up with more information than we can analyze at any given time. And there's always a possibility of, if not human error, human sabotage getting into one of those systems.
And what if the whole thing crashes?
An astute adversary will go after this advantage, whether it's through computer viruses or whether it's through electromagnetic weapons or whether it's through any means meant to disrupt this big network of communications that sits like a bubble above American forces.
Another option for adversaries is to completely slip under the radar, so to speak, to play by rules other than the ones dictated by sophisticated communication systems.
The real key to success in warfare is to get to the future ahead of the next guy. And on September 11th, 2001, for instance, you could say that Al-Qaeda arrived at the future before we did. They brought a new style of warfare to our shores.
Not every challenge faced by the United States can be handled through an email from a command post thousands of miles away.
It took a very low-tech approach to intelligence gathering to find Saddam Hussein. So at what point do we listen to our technical instincts, which allow us to draw further and further away from the battlefield, or do we listen to our political instincts, which require us to have very physical engagements in the sorts of missions that CENTCOM's involved in these days?
Modern war is now monitored by command posts like CENTCOM, combine both technological and human components. Even the communications technology utilized by modern commands has to be read, interpreted, and acted upon by a person.
At the end of the day, war is a human business. All commanders bring a different style of command. Some are very, very comfortable handling it through pure technology, and perhaps have had the training time to understand all that. Others like a mixture of it. I like to look a subordinate in the eyes to understand his confidence. Does he understand my intent? And then you've always got the technological piece to back it up with.
And if the long history of command posts is any indication, that technological component will only get more sophisticated in the future.